This module covers confined and restricted space entry. Common in construction and industrial settings, confined spaces may appear harmless but pose significant risks to your health and safety. Learning to identify, assess, and implement proper controls in these areas is crucial to your health and safety. In Alberta, our OHS code makes a distinction between restricted spaces and confined spaces. Basically, a confined space is a restricted space that could become hazardous to a worker for certain reasons. The formal definitions are as follows. A restricted space is any space that is enclosed or partially enclosed, is not designed or intended for continuous human occupancy, and has a restricted, limited, or impeded means of entry or exit because of its construction. A confined space is any restricted space that may become hazardous because of an atmosphere that is or may be injurious because of oxygen deficiency or enrichment, flammability, explosivity, or toxicity. A condition or changing set of circumstances within the space that presents a potential for injury or illness, or the potential or inherent characteristics of an activity which can produce adverse or harmful consequences within the space. Dangers of confined and restricted spaces. When working in places that fit the definition of a confined or restricted space, some dangers are easy to see, but others may not be as obvious. Sometimes a space may seem safe, and workers may not even think of it as dangerous. However, confined spaces can be tricky, and conditions can quickly change, putting a worker at risk. Each year, the number of incidents related to confined spaces in workplaces is shocking. These incidents can happen for many reasons, such as not recognizing the space as confined, not following proper procedures, not testing the air in the space, not wearing the right safety equipment, not having a rescue plan. There are many ways an incident can happen in a confined space. Hazards like energized equipment, static electricity, or loose materials can lead to dangerous situations. The three main causes of fatalities in confined spaces are atmospheric hazards, like dangerous gases or lack of oxygen, fire or explosion, engulfment, being buried or trapped by materials. Code of practice. Every employer in Alberta must have a written code of practice for workers entering confined and restricted spaces. Workers involved in any aspect of a confined space entry must comply with the code of practice. The code of practice must, at a minimum, identify all existing and potential confined space work locations at the worksite. Take into account and apply all the confined space requirements in the applicable OHS code. Be maintained and periodically reviewed. Guidelines for the code of practice. When creating a code of practice for working in confined spaces, it's a good idea to organize the information into clear sections. Maintaining and reviewing the code of practice. Employers must maintain the code of practice and review it periodically to ensure it is up to date. It is recommended to review the code at least every 3 years or sooner if a new incident occurs, work activities change. Below are some key steps and suggestions for structuring the code of practice. Start with the scope and purpose. Begin by explaining what the code of practice is for and why it is important. You should also introduce the legal requirements that the code is based on, as described in laws like the Occupational Health and Safety OHS Code. Identify confined space locations. Next, include a section that lists all the confined and restricted spaces at the worksite. The following details can make the list more useful. The specific location of each space, for example, address, building, floor, or room number. Photos of the space to help workers recognize it. The type of confined space, for example, tank, sewer, or storage room. Information about how to access the space, for example, hatches, ladders, or doors. Outline practices and procedures. include a section that explains the practices and procedures workers must follow when entering and working in a confined space. These rules must meet all the requirements of the OHS code. Here are some key points to consider. Safe entry and exit procedures. Steps for testing the air and ensuring it is safe. Proper use of personal protective equipment, PPE. Emergency procedures and rescue plans. Follow legal requirements. It's important to consult the relevant sections of the OHS code while developing the code of practice. This ensures that all rules and guidelines meet legislative standards. If any updates are made to the OHS code, the code of practice should also be reviewed and updated to stay compliant. Hazard assessment. Before any worker enters a confined or restricted space, the employer must assign a competent person to conduct a hazard assessment. This person's job is to identify possible dangers in the space, perform inspections and tests as needed, and complete any other necessary tasks to ensure the space is safe to enter. Training requirements. Employers must ensure that workers who will be entering or working in confined or restricted spaces receive training from a competent person. This training must teach workers how to recognize hazards associated with confined or restricted spaces, perform their tasks in a safe and healthy way. Employers are also required to keep records of all training provided, ensure that workers who might respond to an emergency in these spaces are trained in first aid, the correct use of emergency equipment, and emergency procedures specific to the space. Entry permit system. Employers must have an entry permit system in place for confined spaces. This system helps to ensure that workers only enter the space when it is safe to do so and that all necessary precautions have been taken. Before a worker enters a confined space, the employer must make sure a competent person has signed a properly completed entry permit. Keep a copy of this permit easily available. The entry permit system must meet specific requirements outlined in the OHS code. General safety and protection. Employers have several responsibilities to keep workers safe in confined or restricted spaces. These responsibilities include providing safety equipment, emergency equipment, and personal protective equipment as required by the Occupational Health and Safety Code. Protection from hazardous substances and energy. Employers must take steps to ensure workers are safe from dangerous substances and energy. This includes protecting workers from the release of hazardous substances or energy that could harm them, making sure workers don't enter spaces where they could drown, be engulfed, or become trapped unless precautions are in place, controlling hazardous energy in restricted spaces as required by the OHS code, preventing unauthorized entry. Employers must ensure that only authorized workers can enter a confined or restricted space. Anyone not authorized must be prevented from entering. Protection from traffic hazards. Employers are responsible for keeping workers in confined or restricted spaces safe from traffic hazards near the space, such as vehicles or equipment. Atmosphere testing. Before workers can enter a confined space, the atmosphere inside must be tested. Employers must have a competent worker test the air to identify toxic, flammable, or explosive substances. Ensure the oxygen level is within the acceptable range. Use calibrated instruments that are suitable for the atmosphere being tested and follow the manufacturer's instructions. Continuously monitor the atmosphere if it could change while workers are inside. Record the test results and fix any hazards found. Ventilation and purging. Employers must ventilate or purge confined spaces to remove hazardous atmospheres before workers enter. Responsibilities include ensuring proper ventilation or purging when tests show a hazardous atmosphere, using mechanical ventilation if it's needed to maintain safe conditions, training workers on evacuation procedures in case the mechanical ventilation fails, and having an alert system to give workers enough time to exit safely. Providing PPE if ventilation or purging cannot eliminate the hazard. Inerting. If it's not possible to eliminate flammable or explosive atmospheres, the space must be inerted. This means removing oxygen or using another method to make the space non-flammable. Employers must ensure workers entering an inerted space use supplied air respiratory equipment that meets the OHS code. All ignition sources are controlled. The space remains inerted while workers are inside. Emergency response. Employers and workers must ensure no one enters or stays in a confined or restricted space unless a rescue can be carried out if needed. Employers must develop and implement emergency procedures for confined spaces. Include evacuation procedures for situations where the atmosphere becomes dangerous or could harm workers. Tending worker. For each confined or restricted space entry, a competent tending worker must be assigned to communicate with workers inside. The tending worker must have a system to call for help if needed, training in evacuation procedures and the emergency response plan. The tending worker and the employer are responsible for monitoring workers inside the space. Entry and exit. Employers must ensure there is a safe way for workers to enter and exit confined or restricted spaces. Rescue personnel to access these spaces in an emergency. Record retention. Employers must keep records of all entries and work in confined spaces, including permits and test results. Records must be kept for at least 1 year if no incidents occurred, at least 2 years if there was an incident or unplanned event. Hot work. Hot work, such as welding or grinding, can create flames, sparks, or heat that could ignite flammable materials. If hot work is performed in a confined space where there is a risk of fire or explosion, employers must issue a hot work permit, clear or isolate flammable materials, ensure procedures are in place to perform the work safely, test the atmosphere to confirm there are no flammable substances or ignitable dust.